long before hands were used to shape tools, long before they carried food or reached out in cooperation. They were simply a way to hold on. In the deep past, early primates moved through dense forests where survival depended on grip rather than intention. Branches were pathways, heights were safety, falling was consequence. And so the hand existed first as a response to gravity. Fingers were long and curved, shaped not for precision, but for wrapping. The thumb, small and quiet, played only a supporting role. Strength mattered more than subtlety. Contact mattered more than control. These early hands did not explore the world. They clung to it. Every movement was slow and deliberate. The surface of bark, the distance between branches, the pull of weight through muscle and tendon. All of it was learned through repetition, not thought. There was no planning for tomorrow, no shaping of objects, only the present moment and the next secure hold. Over generations, bones thickened where stress returned again and again. Muscles adapted to the endless act of gripping. The hand became reliable, predictable, and strong, but not yet versatile. In this world, hands had no future beyond the next movement. They were not tools. They were not expressions. They were anchors. And yet, in this quiet stability, something important was already forming, a foundation built not for creativity, but for survival. The story of human hands does not begin with invention. It begins with patience. At some point, the ground began to change its relationship with the body. As early ancestors moved more frequently across open spaces, hands were no longer always needed for balance. The body leaned forward, then slowly lifted. Weight shifted into the legs. The spine adjusted, and for brief moments, the hands were no longer touching anything at all. This was not a clean transition. Hands did not suddenly become free. They alternated. Sometimes they supported weight through the knuckles. Sometimes they hovered just above the ground. Sometimes they swung awkwardly at the sides, unsure of their role. In these moments, hands entered a strange, in-between state. They were no longer fully responsible for movement, but they were not yet dedicated to anything else. This created pauses, small stretches of time where the hands did nothing at all. And in evolution, unused time matters. With less constant pressure, the shape of the hand began to change. Fingers shortened slightly. Joints became more flexible. The wrist gained new ranges of motion, no longer locked into the single task of bearing weight. Hands began to rest. They swayed gently as the body moved forward. They reacted to balance rather than enforcing it. They became responsive instead of load-bearing. This freedom was not dramatic. It was subtle, almost accidental. But freeing the hands from the ground did something profound. It gave them time to feel, to adjust, to exist without immediate necessity. And in that quiet freedom, the hand began to wait. Waiting is where new roles are born, not through intention, but through opportunity. And the opportunity had finally arrived. Once the hands were no longer constantly needed for support, something subtle began to happen within them. Change did not arrive as a new function. It arrived as variation. Some fingers bent a little less. Some thumbs turned inward just slightly. Some joints tolerated rotation where before they had resisted it. These differences were small enough to go unnoticed in a single lifetime, but across generations, they accumulated quietly, reshaping the hand from within. The thumb, once short and secondary, began to gain importance. It did not suddenly oppose the fingers. It simply moved closer, close enough to assist, close enough to stabilize. Fingers, once designed to wrap around branches, slowly shortened. Not dramatically, just enough to allow more control when touching uneven surfaces like stone, wood, or hardened soil. The hand was becoming less specialized for one task and more adaptable to many. This flexibility mattered. A hand that could adjust its grip, even slightly, could hold different shapes. A hand that could rotate at the wrist, could approach objects from new angles, and a hand that could apply variable pressure could touch without slipping. None of this was planned. Nothing was invented. The hand was not becoming clever. It was becoming tolerant. Tolerant of variation. Tolerant of uncertainty. Tolerant of new contact. In this phase of evolution, hands were still mostly empty. They did not yet carry meaning or memory, but they were learning something essential: how to change without breaking. And that ability, more than strength, would define everything that came next. The hand was no longer just holding on. It was beginning to adapt. As hands changed shape, they also changed how they sensed the world. Touch was no longer only about grip or pressure. It became a source of information. The skin of the fingers grew more sensitive. Nerve endings multiplied slowly, quietly, responding to differences in texture, temperature, and resistance. Bark felt different from stone. Dry grass felt different from damp soil. The hand began to recognize these differences without effort. This sensitivity did not lead immediately to tool use. It led to awareness. Hands brushed against tall grass while walking. They rested on rocks while pausing. They pressed into the ground while sitting. Each contact added quiet data. The hand learned how much pressure caused pain and how little was needed to maintain contact. It learned when surfaces were sharp, when they were smooth, and when they were unreliable. Touch became a way of listening. Unlike vision, which works at a distance, touch required closeness. It slowed movement. It demanded attention to the present moment. And in doing so, it trained patience. Hands began to guide behavior without conscious thought. A rough surface discouraged grip. A smooth edge invited it. The body adjusted automatically, following the information passed through skin and nerve. This was a new kind of intelligence, not abstract, not verbal. Physical, quiet, immediate. The hand was no longer just reacting to the world, it was learning from it. And once touch became meaningful, hands were no longer passive. They began to shape decisions, subtly influencing how early humans moved, paused, and interacted with their surroundings. The world was no longer something to cling to. It was something to feel. At some point, hands stopped being empty. This did not happen all at once. There was no moment of decision. Objects were lifted briefly, then set down, then lifted again. Food gathered from the ground, fragments of bone, simple stones, and sometimes something far more important, another life. Carrying changed the relationship between the body and the hand. When the hands were occupied, walking had to adapt. Balance shifted. Steps became more deliberate. The spine adjusted its rhythm. The entire body learned to move, while holding weight away from its center. Hands learned endurance. They stayed closed for long periods, not in tension, but in sustained effort. Fingers adjusted constantly, redistributing pressure to avoid fatigue. Grip became dynamic, firm when needed, relaxed when possible. This was not strength alone. It was efficiency. Carrying food allowed resources to be moved across distance. Carrying infants allowed survival beyond immediate mobility. And each act reinforced the value of hands that could hold gently, steadily, and for long durations. Hands were no longer just interacting with the environment. They were supporting the future. Objects gained meaning because they were kept. Infants gained safety because they were held. The hand became a bridge between motion and care. This stage did not require tools. It did not require planning. It required patience, and patience, practiced over thousands of generations, shaped the hand into something capable of sustained responsibility. Hands were no longer free. They were trusted. And once hands were trusted, everything that followed became possible. After hands learned to carry, they began to adjust how they held. This was not about force. It was about control. The thumb, already drifting closer to the fingers, started to meet them more often, not fully opposing, not yet, but touching, stabilizing, guiding. The space between thumb and fingertip became important. Small objects revealed this change first. A sharp-edged stone, a thin fragment of bone, a splintered piece of wood. Holding these required accuracy. Too much pressure caused slipping. Too little caused loss. The hand learned to modulate force, moment by moment. This was the birth of the precision grip, not as a sudden skill, but as a gradual preference. Hands that could hold delicately damaged fewer objects. Hands that could adjust pressure, avoided injury. Over time, these small advantages mattered. The fingers became more independent. Each could move without demanding full participation from the others. The thumb began to act not as a clamp, but as a partner. This partnership changed how objects were explored. Instead of wrapping around them, hands began to approach from specific angles. They turned things over. They tested edges. They paused. Precision introduced intention quietly. Not planning in the modern sense, but awareness. The hand could now decide how to touch, not just whether to hold. And in that ability, something subtle emerged, the possibility of shaping the world, rather than merely enduring it. The hand was no longer just strong. It was becoming exact. Before hands made tools, objects shaped hands. Sharp stones appeared naturally, broken by pressure, weather, or chance. They were not invented. They were found. And when held, they behaved differently from branches or food. Edges cut. Surfaces resisted. Weight concentrated in small areas. Hands that encountered these objects had to adapt. Grip shifted away from full palm contact. Fingers spaced themselves more carefully. The thumb stabilized from the side, preventing rotation. Wrists adjusted angle to avoid injury. This was not tool-making. It was tolerance. Hands learned how to exist near danger without rushing. They learned how to hold something that could harm them without being harmed. Repetition mattered. Each time a sharp edge was handled, the hand refined its approach. Pressure points changed. Skin thickened selectively. Movement slowed. The object remained the same. The hand became different. Over time, hands that could handle these objects safely gained advantage. They could cut meat more efficiently. They could scrape surfaces. They could interact with materials that others avoided. And still, this happened without intention. The hand was not inventing solutions. It was learning boundaries. Objects were not yet extensions of the hand. They were teachers. And through them, the hand learned precision, restraint, and respect for consequences. In this quiet exchange between skin and stone, the future of technology was forming, not through creativity, but through careful repetition. The hand did not create tools. It adapted to them. As hands became more capable, they also became visible. Not just as tools, but as signals. When early humans lived closer together, hands were constantly in view, carrying food, adjusting objects, resting at the side, or reaching out briefly. And in these moments, hands began to communicate. An open hand meant no threat. A slow movement meant patience. A shared object meant cooperation. Hands started to move in predictable ways, offering food, helping someone stand, supporting the injured. These gestures did not require language. They relied on trust built through repetition. Touch between individuals changed as well. Hands steadied children learning to walk. They guided the elderly. They rested briefly on shoulders or backs during movement. These contacts were practical, but they carried meaning. Hands became extensions of intention, not personal intention, but shared intention. Passing an object required timing. Both individuals had to anticipate the movement. Grip loosened on one side as it strengthened on the other. This coordination reinforced social bonds at the level of muscle memory. The hand learned when to release. That mattered. Trust is not only about holding on, it is about knowing when to let go. Groups that moved objects efficiently could share resources. Groups that trusted hands could care for one another. And hands that were reliable became central to social stability. In this phase, hands were no longer just shaped by the environment. They were shaped by each other. And through that quiet cooperation, something new emerged, a shared rhythm of movement that tied individuals into a group. Hands were no longer solitary. They were social. As walking became more stable and carrying more familiar, hands were no longer in constant use. They began to rest. This rest was not inactivity, it was efficiency. Hands swung gently at the sides while the body moved forward. Fingers curled slightly, never fully open, never tense. The motion was rhythmic, balanced, and predictable. Resting hands conserved energy. Muscles learned when to engage and when to release. Small adjustments replaced constant effort. This mattered over long distances. When hands were relaxed, the shoulders loosened. When shoulders loosened, breathing became easier. When breathing stabilized, endurance improved. The entire body benefited from hands that knew when to do nothing. Rest also created awareness. Hands that were not occupied became sensitive again. They noticed temperature changes, air movement, subtle shifts in balance. The hand remained attentive even while relaxed. This combination, readiness without tension, became one of the most important qualities of human movement. It allowed early humans to travel far without exhaustion, to respond quickly without strain, to remain calm in motion. In modern terms, this is efficiency. But in evolutionary terms, it is patience made physical. The hand learned that constant action was unnecessary. Sometimes, the most effective role is to remain ready and at ease. Hands no longer rushed. They waited. As hands became more precise, the brain began to change with them. This was not a sudden expansion. It was a quiet redistribution. Regions of the brain that controlled fine movement slowly grew more detailed. More neural space was devoted to the fingers, the thumb, the wrist. Movements that once required full attention became automatic. The hand began to send richer information back to the brain. Pressure, texture, resistance, and motion were translated into signals that refined future movement. Each action improved the next. This created a loop. The brain guided the hand. The hand informed the brain. Together, they adjusted. Hands that could perform small, controlled actions encouraged further neural refinement. and brains that could process fine feedback allowed hands to become even more precise. Neither led alone. This partnership did not produce intelligence in the abstract sense. It produced coordination, reliability, the ability to repeat an action with increasing consistency. The hand became predictable to the brain. The brain became confident in the hand. This trust reduced hesitation. Movements became smoother, quieter, more economical. Energy was no longer wasted on correction. In this phase, the hand stopped feeling separate from intention. It became integrated, an extension of thought without requiring conscious direction. The mind did not command the hand. It flowed through it. And in that flow, complexity increased without noise, without drama, without urgency. The evolution of intelligence did not announce itself. It settled in, one movement at a time. Long before spoken language, hands were already communicating. A raised hand could pause movement. A pointed finger could direct attention. A repeated motion could demonstrate an action. These gestures were not symbolic at first. They were practical, showing how to hold something, how to strike stone, how to pass food without dropping it. Teaching happened through movement. Hands repeated actions slowly, allowing others to watch and imitate. Mistakes were corrected without words, through repositioning fingers, adjusting grip, or guiding motion. In this way, knowledge moved from body to body. Hands also carried emotion, quietly. They reached out during uncertainty. They steadied during fatigue. They rested together in stillness. These moments did not require interpretation. The meaning was immediate, felt rather than understood. Hands became extensions of intention, but also of care. As cooperation deepened, gestures grew more refined. Subtle changes in movement conveyed urgency or calm. Rhythm mattered. Timing mattered. Hands could now shape not just objects, but behavior. This was expression without language, communication without sound. The hand had become more than a tool. It was a medium, a way of transmitting knowledge, trust, and continuity across generations. And all of this happened quietly. No symbols, no alphabets, only movement. The hand learned to speak long before the mouth did. We arrive at the final movement. The hands you use today are not new. They carry the memory of every grip, every release, every pause that came before. Your fingers still curl slightly when at rest, not from habit, but from inheritance. Your thumb still moves instinctively toward the fingers, ready to stabilize, to guide, to adjust. When you walk, your hands swing without effort. When you hold something delicate, pressure adjusts automatically. When you touch another person, your hands know how to be gentle. These abilities were not designed. They were learned slowly, over millions of years, through patience rather than urgency. The modern world often fills hands with objects, screens, and tools. But beneath all of that, the structure remains unchanged. The same bones, the same joints, the same quiet intelligence. Every time your hand rests at your side, it echoes a long history of endurance and restraint. Every time you reach out, you repeat an ancient movement, one shaped by gravity, cooperation, and time. The story of human hands is not a story of invention. It is a story of continuity, of small changes accumulating quietly, of movement refined without haste, of patience made physical. And as the day ends and the hands finally come to rest, they do what they have always done best. They wait.